Did the Soviet Union ever send its own boots onto the jungles of Vietnam, or was its role confined to the shadows of diplomatic halls and covert airfields? The answer lies in a tangled web of political calculus, clandestine assistance, and the stark limits of Cold War doctrine, a story that stretches from the early 1950s through the final days of Saigon's fall in 1975. In the aftermath of World War II, Soviet leaders, first under Stalin and later under Khrushchev, recognized the strategic importance of a unified, communist Indochina as a counterweight to American influence in Southeast Asia. Yet the Soviet Union's official policy, articulated at the 1955 Geneva Conference, insisted that any assistance to the Democratic Republic of Vietnam would be material and technical, never involving Soviet combat troops, a stance designed to avoid a direct confrontation with the United States that could erupt into a Third World War. The first concrete Soviet contribution arrived in 1950 when the USSR dispatched a small advisory team of engineers and artillery specialists to assist the Viet Minh in their struggle against French colonial forces. These early advisors, often former Red Army officers with experience in mountain warfare, helped the Viet Minh standardize their tactics, introduce Soviet-made 76mm field guns, and establish rudimentary radio communications. By 1954, after the decisive Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the Soviet contingent had grown to roughly 200 personnel, including political officers and logistics experts, all operating under the cover of civilian technical missions and never wearing Soviet uniforms. Between 1955 and 1960, the Soviets supplied the North Vietnamese army with over 2,000 rifles, 500 machine guns, and more than 300,000 rounds of ammunition, as well as anti-aircraft artillery that would later prove decisive against American bombing raids. Soviet technicians also oversaw the construction of the first major airfields at Phuoc Yên and Kep, enabling the North to receive additional aid from both the USSR and its Chinese ally. These projects required a cadre of Soviet engineers, surveyors, and construction workers, many of whom lived in temporary camps near the airfields, yet they never formed a combat formation. The launch of the Soviet Luna 3 satellite in 1959 and the subsequent publicized images of the Earth from space added a symbolic layer to Soviet involvement, as the USSR began to portray its support for Vietnam as part of a global struggle against imperialism. However, the true turning point arrived in 1961, when Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev met with Ho Chi Minh in Hanoi and pledged a new era of cooperation. That pledge translated into a massive influx of armaments. By 1965, the Soviet Union was delivering an estimated 1,122mm howitzers, 300 SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missiles, and a fleet of MiG-21 fighter jets to North Vietnam. Each delivery came with Soviet pilots and ground crews for training, but these individuals were officially listed as advisors and were prohibited from engaging in combat. The arrival of the SA-2 missiles in 1965 sparked a fierce debate within the Kremlin. Some hardliners, recalling the Korean War experience, argued that Soviet pilots should be deployed to protect the missiles and to challenge American air superiority directly. This arrangement allowed the Soviets to claim they were merely training their allies, while in reality they retained the ability to fire on U.S. aircraft if the political decision was made in Moscow. During the height of the air war, from 1966 to 1968, Soviet technicians installed over 150 SAM sites along the Ho Chi Minh Trail and around major industrial centers such as Haiphong and Hanoi. The Soviet presence on the ground grew to an estimated 1,500 personnel, including radar operators, missile technicians, and signal intelligence specialists. These men worked in concealed bunkers, often under the cover of night, and their activities were closely monitored by American reconnaissance aircraft. Nevertheless, no Soviet soldier was ever captured in combat, a fact that both sides used to reinforce their narratives. The United States portrayed the Soviets as ghosts meddling from afar, while the North Vietnamese emphasized their own agency in the war effort. The diplomatic front also saw Soviet troops in a more indirect form. In 1969, the Soviet Union dispatched a brigade-strength contingent of naval infantry to the port of Cam Ranh, ostensibly to protect Soviet merchant vessels delivering oil and equipment to the north. This force, numbering roughly 3,000 men, was technically a protective detachment under the command of Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, but its presence signaled a willingness to risk a direct confrontation if American forces threatened Soviet assets. The brigade's stay was brief, lasting only 3 months, yet its deployment demonstrated the Soviet capacity to project conventional forces in Southeast Asia without officially declaring war. The most controversial episode occurred in 1972 during the Easter Offensive, when the North Vietnamese launched a massive conventional invasion of the South. Their mission was to train elite North Vietnamese sapper units in demolition techniques and to coordinate the placement of Soviet-supplied anti-tank mines. While the paratroopers did not engage in direct combat, their expertise accelerated the North's ability to breach American defensive lines, contributing to the eventual stalemate that forced the United States to negotiate a ceasefire. In parallel, the Soviet Union's Secret Service, the KGB, established a network of intelligence operatives throughout South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Troop movements and negotiating positions. Their presence underscores that Soviet involvement extended beyond material aid to include a full spectrum of clandestine operations, though none of these operatives were formally recognized as combat troops. The Paris Peace Accords of January 1973 brought a nominal end to foreign combatants in Vietnam, but the Soviet Union continued to send technical advisors to assist the North in rebuilding its war-torn infrastructure. Between 1973 and 1975, Soviet engineers oversaw the reconstruction of the Hanoi-Haiphong Railway, a 162-kilometer line crucial for moving supplies to the front. The project employed over 2,000 Soviet workers, many of whom lived in temporary housing near the tracks, and it involved the importation of Soviet-made locomotives and railcars. This post-war assistance was framed as reconstruction aid, yet it kept a substantial Soviet footprint in the country until the final evacuation of Saigon on April 30, 1975. The fall of Saigon marked the culmination of a three-decade Soviet involvement that never included a single Soviet combat unit officially designated as a troop. Nevertheless, the cumulative presence of thousands of Soviet personnel as engineers, technicians, advisors, and intelligence officers created a de facto Soviet military presence that profoundly shaped the conduct and outcome of the Vietnam War. The Soviet Union's cautious approach, dictated by the fear of a direct NATO-Warsaw Pact clash, forced it to rely on indirect methods that nevertheless delivered decisive firepower, advanced air defense systems, and strategic guidance to the North Vietnamese. Post-war analyses by both American and Vietnamese scholars reveal that the Soviet Union's restraint was a calculated gamble. By avoiding the deployment of regular combat troops, the USSR preserved its ability to negotiate with the United States on other global flashpoints, such as the Cuban Missile Crisis and the 1973 Yom Kippur War, while still securing a communist foothold in Southeast Asia. The Soviet decision to limit its involvement to technical and advisory roles also allowed it to claim moral high ground, positioning itself as a supporter of anti-imperialist movements rather than an aggressor. This narrative proved valuable in the United Nations, where the Soviet bloc consistently voted against resolutions condemning North Vietnam, citing the principle of self-determination. Yet the Soviet policy had unintended consequences. The reliance on Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missiles and sophisticated artillery forced North Vietnamese commanders to develop tactics that emphasized static defense, which later limited their operational flexibility during the rapid 1975 offensive that swept the South. Moreover, the presence of Soviet advisors sometimes created friction with Chinese aid workers, as the two communist giants vied for influence over Hanoi's military decisions. The Soviet-Chinese rivalry manifested in competing supply chains, duplicate training programs, and occasional accusations of sabotage, complicating the North's logistical network at a time when coordination was crucial. Economic data from the Soviet archives indicate that by 1975 the total value of Soviet military aid to North Vietnam exceeded $2 billion in contemporary dollars, a sum equivalent to roughly 15% of the Soviet defense budget at the time. This massive outlay reflected both ideological commitment and strategic calculation, as the USSR sought to prevent a domino effect that could see neighboring Laos, Cambodia, and even Thailand fall under U.S. influence. The Soviet Union also financed the construction of the Hanoi University of Foreign Languages, a training ground for Vietnamese diplomats who would later serve in Soviet embassies across Africa and Latin America, extending the war's legacy into the global Cold War theater. The legacy of Soviet involvement in Vietnam reverberated long after the war's end. In the 1980s, as Vietnam turned toward market reforms and normalized relations with the United States, Moscow's influence waned, and many of the Soviet veterans who had served as advisors returned to a USSR on the brink of dissolution. Their experiences, recorded in memoirs and declassified reports, reveal a paradox: they fought a war without firing a shot, yet their technical expertise and strategic counsel were instrumental in shaping a conflict that claimed over 3 million lives. The Soviet Union's covert footprint in Vietnam thus stands as a testament to the limits of conventional military power in an era where ideology, technology, and diplomacy intertwined on a battlefield that stretched from the Mekong Delta to the corridors of the Kremlin. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the newly independent Russian Federation inherited a complex legacy in Vietnam, including lingering Soviet-built infrastructure, a fleet of aging Mi-21s still in Vietnamese service, and a generation of Vietnamese officers trained under Soviet doctrine. Russia's subsequent military cooperation with Vietnam, now framed as strategic partnership, builds upon the foundations laid during those decades, illustrating how the shadow of Soviet involvement continues to shape regional security dynamics. The question of whether Soviet troops ever fought in Vietnam therefore resolves not into a simple yes or no, but into a nuanced understanding of what constitutes a troop. While no Soviet infantry division ever marched through the rice paddies of the Mekong, thousands of Soviet personnel performed the functions of soldiers, building airfields, operating missile batteries, training combat engineers, and gathering intelligence, thereby embedding the Soviet military machine into the very fabric of the war. Their presence, though concealed, was as real as any battlefield casualty, and it altered the strategic calculus of both superpowers. In the final analysis, the Soviet Union's engagement in the Vietnam War illustrates the paradox of Cold War conflict, a war fought with the firepower of great powers, yet waged by proxy forces whose victories and defeats were measured not in Soviet uniforms on the ground, but in the silent hum of radar stations and the steady flow of ammunition across the sea. The story of Soviet involvement is a reminder that wars are often won and lost in the shadows, where the footprints of foreign advisors are as decisive as the boots of frontline soldiers.